Welcome, this is Jim, host of the Faith Influencer podcast, where we're going to dive into discussions on faith's role in everyday life, from navigating blended families to overcoming challenges. I'm a husband, a father, a Bible teacher, an advocate for applying faith to everyday life. So tune in as I share personal stories, valuable insights, and practical wisdom. I have a question for you. When is the last time you heard a sermon on sex? When is the last time you heard your preacher get up and talk about sexual relationships between a man and a woman? I bet the majority of you can't even recall when you've heard a message or something on sex inside the church. Well, this is Jim Cunningham with Faith Influencer, and I want to welcome you today. And we're going to talk about sex inside of a marriage, one. And our viewpoint is going to be a Christian viewpoint, and it's going to be how we understand God's word about sex. But we're going to talk about it, and we're going to talk about a lot of different areas that maybe are uncomfortable for you to hear, maybe are uncomfortable for me to talk about, but yet we're going to address it here. So I want to go through some things that's going to just give us an understanding of what God thinks about it, and then we're going to deal with some practical issues. So this is where we're headed, so hang with me as we work our way through this. Ought to be fun. So this three-letter word that our world is so preoccupied with, you see it everywhere. It is on every program, every commercial, every magazine cover, everywhere you go, this world is preoccupied with sex. However, there is some parameters around this gift that God has given us that I want to talk about it because it will make it for you and for your home and for your marriage, it will make it so much better if you have some understanding of what God says about it. So let's talk about that. And the first thing I want to talk about is you can live without sex. So let me start there. You can live without sex. Now, I know some of you guys who are listening are thinking, no, I would die without sex. No, you won't. You can live without it. That's why people like the Apostle Paul said that he was single, and that was a gift. The gift that he received from God was singleness. So I just want to say that at the beginning. Some of you have received this gift called singleness, and so you're not in a relationship and you're a Christian, so having sexual relations outside of marriage is not an option for you because you are a believer, and so it's a gift. You can live without sex. But that's not what we're really talking about. We're talking about sex inside of marriage. So do you realize that sex is a gift from God? God created it. It all started with God. God gave this amazing gift, sex, this amazing gift to a man and to a woman inside of marriage. Now, that's how God created it. And does this surprise you that when I say to you, let me say it this way, God is pro-sex. I mean, that's an unusual way to say it. You're not going to hear your pastor say that on Sunday, but it's the truth. God is pro-sex. God invented it. It was a gift. And do you know why God created it? For different reasons, but he did create it so that we could enjoy it. That's one of the reasons. Now, procreation, obviously, especially when you go to the beginning of the Bible in the book of Genesis, procreation was perhaps the main reason he created it because they were to replenish the earth. They were to start having children, and they were going to build a population. So we see that. And that's still a purpose today, is to have children and raise godly children and shoot those children as arrows out into the world to serve the Lord, and then they turn around and do the same thing. So having children certainly is a big part of why God created sex. But that's not the focus of what we're talking about on this subject either. The main focus we're talking about is the role that it plays between a husband and a wife and why God gave it to us. And then we're going to talk about why you struggle with that so often. So God gave us this gift called sex so that we could enjoy it. And guess what? Because God is the creator of it, he knows best how it ought to work. He knows best how to enjoy it the most. So if God created and he knows best, so let's follow his outline. Now, I'm going to say something that some of you are struggling with because of the way you were raised. I don't really know if I was raised this way. In my family, we didn't even talk about it. I mean, it wasn't even discussed. My dad never came to me and talked to me about sex before I got married. Didn't happen. As a matter of fact, I was in college, and toward the end of college, I was getting married, and I had a good friend of mine who was several years older. I don't know why he thought he should have this talk with me, but maybe it was the Lord laid it on his heart, because no one had ever had this talk with me, and I had never had sex. I kept myself pure. That was a Christian value that I had, and so I was waiting until marriage, and I did. And I know that shocks many of you, because that just doesn't happen so often today. I would recommend it. That's the way God really wants it. So I did wait, but I knew nothing. I mean, I knew nothing, and my dad didn't bring it up, and thank the Lord my mom didn't bring it up, because I wouldn't want to hear about it from her. So I had this friend in college who took me to lunch and sat down. His name was Jay. He actually was in my wedding. And Jay said, "Have you ever had this talk?" And it was embarrassing already. And I'm like, "No, Jay, I haven't had this talk. Are we getting ready to have this talk?" And he said, "Yeah, let's talk about it." So Jay took me down this sex talk. Well, I'm grateful he did. I was open to all the information I could get, and I didn't want to get it in the wrong places. So thank you, Jay, all these years later, for the sex talk that you and I got to have. I will say, I didn't follow my dad's footsteps. I have children who are already out of the household, and we for sure have had those talks. Even with my daughter, we've had this talk. Embarrassing as it was, we had this talk. So it's this wonderful gift from God. And I want you to know, in spite of how some of you were raised, maybe like me, where it was off limits, that I don't want you to have any guilt around sex. Now, there are so many of you who have had traumatic things that have happened in your life that it's created guilt as related to sex, but that's not how God created it. God created this to enjoy it guilt-free. Now, there's actually a Bible verse that talks about this. Do you know that in the book of Hebrews, which is toward the end of the Bible, that it makes this statement? It says that the marriage bed, and this is the word that it uses, it says that the marriage bed is undefiled. Do you know what that means? It means that what you and your spouse do in the marriage bed, and notice that it was very clear about the marriage bed, not outside of marriage, that what you and your spouse do in your bedroom under the umbrella of marriage is okay. No guilt. Guilt-free. That's how God designed it. Within marriage, guilt-free. Enjoy this gift that God has given us. So I want you to understand right at the beginning that God created this, and it's a gift, and God is pro-sex, and you should enjoy it. So remove all the stigmas that may be there. That's how God created it. But then let me also say that it's more than physical. We're going to dig into this as we go along today, but it's more than physical. It really, I think, begins as spiritual. And I think there's some proof of that in the Bible as well. I think it begins as spiritual in this way. You remember in the very beginning in the book of Genesis, chapter 2, it says this. It says that a man and wife, when they come together, and this is the phrase that it uses, shall become, remember what it says? One flesh. They become one flesh. In the New Testament, Jesus and Paul quote that verse, same verse, and they expound on it, and they're talking about the spiritual nature of sex, that when a man and a woman come together in marriage, that it is a deep spiritual relationship. It's not just physical. It's way beyond physical. It has spiritual meaning, so much so that the Bible says two people become one flesh. Now, when Paul talks about this, and I'm going to throw this in here because remember, this is Faith Influencer Podcast. I always say this. We're under the umbrella of faith. So that's our viewpoint, okay? So it's so spiritual that when you have sex, you become one flesh. Paul says that's why you can't ever have sex outside of marriage. That's why adultery is so bad, because you step outside of marriage and have sex with someone else, what have you just done with someone else? You have become one flesh. So that creates something inside of you that God never intended. So it is a very spiritual thing when two people come together and they have sex. That's part of the enjoyment of it. There's hardly anything, would you agree with this? Let me know in the comments. There's hardly anything that makes you feel as close to your spouse as when you are intimate together, when you have that intimacy. Because that's true, what I want you to know is that there's a way to deepen that intimacy. So hang in there because we're going to get into that as we go along. So, sex is spiritual. You following? God created it. It's deeper than physical. God created it spiritual so that our souls join together, not just our bodies. And then the next thing, I'm going to say sex is important. Now, I've already emphasized that, but sex is important. And because it's important, Paul goes through this whole thing about not withholding it. Now, ladies, let me ask you something, because this is the stigma that's placed on ladies. Is it true? I'm put it in the comments. Be honest, because I don't know you. Is it true that women manipulate men with sex? Is that true? I have the feeling that it is. I have the feeling that there are a lot of wives who know how to manipulate her husband's need for sex to get what she wants. Surely that's not true. Surely it is true. I look forward to hearing what you have to say about it. So, you know what Paul says? Paul says, do not withhold sex. He's very clear about that. That's because sex is so important to your relationship, and especially to a man. Now, don't bombard me with criticism because I said especially to a man. Sex is different for men and women. We're going to talk about that again later. But it is especially important for a man, and he has these desires that he wants fulfilled. And when you withhold sex from him, it creates all kinds of issues. So Paul said, knowing that, even though Paul had never had sex, he's writing under the direction of the Holy Spirit. Paul says, don't withhold from each other, unless there is an exception. He gives an exception. Paul said, unless you and your spouse agree, okay? Are you following? Remember, we're going by the Bible's guidelines here. He said, okay, if you're not going to have sex, it must be a mutual agreement. A mutual agreement. You can't just decide, wife, that you're mad at your husband, and so you're going to teach him you're not going to have sex with him this week or for a couple of weeks. Oh, you're not teaching him. You're creating something that you don't realize what you're creating. Paul says, do not withhold sex from each other unless you've agreed. Well, why would two people, especially a guy like the guys I know, that would never agree to that? Why would you agree to not having sex? Well, Paul says there may be a time that you want to spend spiritually seeking the Lord in fasting and prayer. And so you come to an agreement with your spouse that for these days that we're going to search God and the Word and pray and fast for whatever the reason. We're going to put aside food, and we're going to set aside sex and all these things during this time. So Paul says, that would be good, but it must be by mutual agreement. Can you grasp how important the sex is and how much importance the Bible is placing on sex when it goes to all of these instructions about it? So I hope you're seeing that. So we want to get it right. So that's why we're walking through this. Sex, here's the next thing I want to say. Sex is the ultimate expression of giving. It is the ultimate expression of giving. I can't hardly think of anything that expresses the idea of trust and a willingness to give yourself to someone than what happens in sexual relationships. I mean, think about this. Think about here's a man and a woman. Let's say they're outside of the norm today and they waited to have sex until marriage. That doesn't happen very often, But let's just say here's this man and this woman who've waited, and they've they've gathered together for the wedding. They're all excited. I've been here, so I know what I'm talking about because this was my case. I'm going through the wedding, and we waited. But this is what I knew. I knew that tonight, this was at my wedding. I knew that tonight, on that night, I was having sex. Now, that's kind of embarrassing, but that was what I knew on my wedding night. And same for my wife. She knew the same thing. That's what was happening. Do you think that was on my mind during this whole wedding? It was like, preacher, hurry up. Get this ceremony over. We got to go. So it's all over, and we head off to the first stop. This was honeymoon night. First stop. My dad had purchased this room for us. And I'm not kidding. We get to this hotel, and she's as nervous as can be because we've waited. This is a big deal. You get it? So we get the luggage, and we're still kind of dressed up, and we walk into the hotel. Dad said he bought us this room. We go into the hotel, and we check in. And when we check in, the lady said, "Oh, you have the honeymoon suite." I'm like, great. Everybody knows now. They're all looking at us. They know we're headed to the honeymoon suite. Yes, we have the honeymoon suite. Congratulations. So we get to the room, open the room, and I'm not kidding you. The entire ceiling is mirrors. Is mirrors. I'm like, Dad, this was for us, not for your fantasy. We go into this room, this honeymoon suite, big room, king size bed, and the whole ceiling is mirrors. Now, my brand new wife, who had never had sex either, was like, we're turning the lights off. And I'm like, I'm good with that. Let's turn the lights off, at least tonight. So that was our experience. But do you know what? Even though it was way better later, there was this incredible feeling of when you give yourself to someone else, what that creates. That's how God designed it. There is nothing more giving than when you have sex with your spouse. Nothing says that you trust them more. Nothing says that you love them more, that you want them more, than when you can totally give yourself to them. So that brings up a point that we're going to cover next time. How do you deal with it when you don't feel like that any longer? When you don't want to give everything to them anymore? Things have happened and you've pulled apart and you're struggling with that. What do we do with that? And then what do we do when we've gone through a divorce and we've remarried and here we are again in our marriage bedroom? How do we give ourselves all over? Well, we're going to talk about that next time, but we've laid the groundwork already for this talk about sex that you're not going to hear in church. So thank you for joining us. This is Jim Cunningham with Faith Influencer.